Welcome to the XYChromies Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by co-host Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Very good, Pierce. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Well, today what we're going to be talking about is addiction, but first let's cover some good news. In a world dominated by sensational doom and gloom news, we felt it would be nice to start each show off covering a good news story and share our thoughts. So, what do you have for us today, Richard?
I have a little news story from Science News, and it's a little good news about the myriad of problems that affect honeybee colonies and the colony collapse disorder that we've kind of heard about for the last 20 years. The role that honeybees play in our civilization and our food system is pretty intense. It turns out that a great many crops that we rely on that are cornerstones of the food economy and our diets are pollinated by honeybees, which means that's how that crop is propagated every year. So the uh, um, the crisis would be that if the honeybees disappeared entirely, we would be in a problem where pollination would be next to impossible to do at the industrial scale, or we would have to find another pollinator. So, a vaccine for bees has an unexpected effect. Let me see if I can read that again. A vaccine for bees has an unexpected effect. Honeybees immunized against a bacteria also fought off a virus. So, a little background on viruses and bacteria. Those are different types of things.
Yeah.
Bacteria is an actual organism. It fits our definition of life, and bacteria provide benefits to human beings, for example, as they play a role in our digestive system, but uh, they can get out of hand and they can perform uh, destructive roles in nature as well. And so it turns out in honeybee colonies, honeybee hives vaccinated against a bacterial disease had much lower levels of an unrelated viral disease than did unvaccinated hives, reports veterinarian Nigel Swift of Dillon Animal Health. This is reported on April 3rd, World Vaccine Congress. So researchers at Dillon, based in Athens, Georgia, designed the bee vaccine to protect against American foul brood, a fatal disease caused by a spore-forming bacterium
Hmm.
called Panabacillus larvae. Adult bees don't get sick, but can spread the spores in the hive where the disease infects and kills larvae. Spores can remain viable for more than 50 years, so beekeepers with infected colonies must destroy hives by irradiating them or burning them to keep the disease in check.
Oh, wow.
A vaccine may save bee lives and beekeeper livelihoods. All right, so
Jeez.
a little more on foul brood. So foul brood disease is one of many problems plaguing bees. So pesticides, parasites, climate change, and nutritional stress all make bees more susceptible to infectious disease. So from April 2022 to April 2023, U.S. beekeepers lost an estimated 40% of their colonies, according to the Bee Informed Partnership, a nonprofit research organization. Which is, if anybody knows how percentages work, 48% is half. It's all but half of all beehives in a year were lost. And I can't stress enough, if honeybees make up the basis of our uh, food pollination and propagation economy, that's tragic. And it's expensive for beekeepers.
Yeah,
So Dillon's vaccine.
oh, I was gonna say it. I just think of, what another species that is pretty near and dear to our heart in Oregon, because honeybees are so integral to, a lot of the wildflowers, and, honey
Mhm.
is a big export from Oregon. We
Yeah.
have a lot of honey, a lot of different wildflower honeys, even local. And I think of the beaver, and how I believe you actually know the term for this. I don't remember what the term is, but when a species basically like props up an entire like ecosystem of life around it, and when it collapses, like it can cause, serious follow-on effects, like the um, beavers being trapped into almost extinction did over here in the Northwest. What is that term?
You're thinking of keystone species.
That's the one.
If
Yes.
you want to know what a keystone is, go ahead and look up that terminology on Google, and you'll find a bunch of images of stonemason work. And what you'll find is that a keystone is a rock or stone or brick that's carved in a very specific way so that it fits at the very top of an arch. And if you build this arch by putting in scaffolding, put the keystone at the top, it's shaped like my hands are wedged like this, and then you can remove the scaffolding and that arch will stay there. But if you remove that keystone, the arch will fall. Well, that's your idea of these really important species in the natural habitat. Just by way of mentioning, honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought here by Europeans
Hmm. I had no idea.
and then became a keystone species in food production. So they weren't necessary for native North American plants and
Fauna.
ecosystems
Yeah.
because they had other pollinators. But what makes honeybees ideal for our food system is that they can be um, industrialized, however, at great cost to the bees.
Yeah.
In fact, let me digress for a moment and say that with regard to things like vaccinations are really only necessary following the advent of the agricultural revolution. So this idea of vaccinations is it's fraught in our current culture because they've been characterized as a mysterious vector for nefarious means. But really, all vaccinations are a way for us to artificially improve our natural immune system. It gives our immune system a piece of information that it can use to then defend itself, which is exactly what happens in this article that I'm reading from. And
Yeah, like
so
anything else, like
the
vitamins, we naturally supplement our body with, a multivitamin and other vitamins, hopefully that, we understand
yeah,
our our daily diet might not be fulfilling, right? Just because of the way
yeah,
we've industrialized our agricultural markets and so on and so forth.
I like to point to some of the history that I've read and the authors talk about these ideas of what was the trade-off that we made to become agrarian as opposed to being hunter-gatherers, which is thought of as the basic transition that humans made about between 10 and 5,000 years ago. Like around the globe, human beings over this 5,000 year period went from the dominant source of our calories coming from things, creatures and plants and insects that we harvested from the land and consumed to things, animals and plants and insects or whatever that we cultivated in crops. And that transition is called the agricultural revolution as in a historical context. What authors like Yuval Noah Harari talk about is that this trade-off didn't actually make us better off in many ways that are separate from the available calories that we had. And so in a natural environment where we are hunting and gathering, we have seasonal foods and we have varieties of foods within those seasons. So during the summer and fall harvest season, we're going to have access to a lot of fruits. In the spring, we're going to have access to a lot of green shoots and new plants. And um, we could match this to the life cycles of prey animals that we're eating as well. And in the fall and winter, of course, we have whatever is remaining either in the ground as tubers or that we might have stored in cairns or caches that we can eat over the scarcity season. And so that variety of things represents a diet, which is an omnivore's diet, that supplies us with a variety of different means of ingesting the critical materials that our body needs to synthesize cells and perform cellular function. And that goes from everything from the foundations of life, which are to say uh, uh, fertility and pregnancy and the ability for people to reproduce, to the things that might prolong our lives and give us longevity well into our ninth decade. So there's just a number of different ways to think about nutrition from the context of what we would have been consuming when we lived in Paleolithic times.
Yeah.
Boy, I'm getting way off the. I'm getting way into the tall weeds here because, of course, I want to at some point in the future circle back around and talk about the paleo diet and how that is a misnomer to us. How that
Uh,
is actually a confusion of our past.
okay. Well, let me attempt to button it up, and we'll transition, I suppose, since we could go full off the cusp.
So
When you were go ahead.
let me come back around to agriculture and agrarian living, which is to say that what we're doing is we're asking with human agriculture humans and animals to live in close proximity. And in contrast to our Paleolithic time, we we wouldn't have been living in close proximity with anything. And if we would have been exposed to a disease vector, it might have hurt that clan or tribe, but it wouldn't have been large scale or spread around. Well, agrarian civilization meant two things. One, a lot of close contact living with humans and animals. And two, trade networks, which represent an ideal vector for disease transmission. Well, it turns out what we have done to honeybees by industrializing them is to give them the exact same scenario that human beings created for ourselves in our agricultural revolution. We have honeybees living in high population, close contact with each other. So the hives are always kept on flatbed trucks and moved around the country. And in what I just described, trade networks basically. We're giving the honeybee hives the ability to spread around and to be distributed around the country and to move from place to place, which is how they're utilized for agriculture. So what we've essentially done is taken a thing, a natural organism, industrialized it, and then in doing so, exposed it to all kinds of disease vectors. And one of those disease vectors is a bacterium that affects larvae. So if you absolutely positively want to reduce the population of something in nature, affect it either by reducing the number of females in the population or completely attack its neophyte state, attack its larval state, attack its infants, attack its
Yeah.
fetuses, whatever. Attack the things that have not turned themselves into a reproductive member of that group. So let me return to this real quick and I'll kind of wrap this up. And that is to say, so Dillon's vaccine against foul brood disease doesn't rely on tiny syringes. Instead, bees inoculated through a sugar paste, which researchers have spiked with heat-killed pea larvae. That's that larva I mentioned earlier. Worker bees eat the candy and incorporate it into their jelly. They feed it to the queen, and inside the queen's gut, bits of that bacteria attach to a protein. This in turn transports the vaccine fragments to the ovaries where they can be deposited in eggs. So this is like, okay, how do we get it into the queen? Well, we have to get it into the workers first. They convert it to the royal jelly. Queen eats the jelly. That goes into her reproductive organs through her digestive tract. And so uh, the ovaries where this can be deposited in the eggs. So a larva hatched from the eggs. These should be protected from disease. That would be the ideal outcome. And so the article goes on and talks about how testing is difficult and so forth. And based on the evidence of these hives, the U.S. Department of Agriculture gave conditional approval.
Hmm.
So this is the interesting thing about all forms of science. In this country, we have regulatory bodies that govern how we use food and medicine. Thank goodness. There was a time before that, and it was a wild west of times. And so what the U.S. Department of Agriculture says here is, okay, so far your study looks like it's promising. Go ahead and use it, and we're gonna keep looking at this. And if something goes badly with it or there are unintended consequences, this conditional permission could be pulled. So beekeepers who had been using the vaccine told Dillon, this research organization, that vaccine colonies seem to have an all-around improvement in health. It could not be explained alone by just reducing the incidence of foul brood disease. And the company decided to look at a variety of diseases, honey production, and other measures of bee health. And so what happened here is that researchers were looking at one vector, this bacterium, and invented a methodology of inoculating the queens, who would then pass it on to their larvae. Okay, brilliant. And it seems to work. So the surprising result is that vaccinated hives were protected from a viral disease that is spread by Varroa mites. Now, this is an entirely separate topic. And this is the interesting thing about studying nature and then essentially what we're doing here with this vaccine, interfering with it. Because there are other potentiating factors of treating a disease. So both vaccinated and unvaccinated hives started the study with the same number of mites and baseline level of virus, as measured by a PCR test. Virus levels continued to rise in the unvaccinated hives, but declined in the vaccinated group. At the end of the study, vaccinated hives had accumulated 83% less virus than vaccinated hives did,
Whoa,
even though the number of
83%
mites have remained
is
the same.
that's well, now we're talking about some serious percentages. When we're
Yeah,
48
yeah,
now, 80, yeah, okay.
yeah.
Wow. Did they explain what these findings indicated to them, or did they figure out why this was happening?
So at the end of the article, they make this overture, which is like, as a member of the public, I would say, oh well, this is said and done, but the overture is this. Let's keep this in mind. It's an important finding for sure if it is repeatable. A central idea to the scientific method. So this is a quote from biochemist Andrea Gwynn of the biopharmaceutical company GSK based in Middlesex, England. Gwynn, who works on vaccines for people, is a hobbyist beekeeper. So they found someone who dabbles in both things, although is not a researcher on the topic. She is particularly interested in whether queen bees can pass on defense against American foul brood and perhaps other infections for more than one egg-laying season, and whether a queen's drone sons and daughter queens could pass on the protections to a second generation.
Whoa.
These results are still preliminary, and the researchers aren't sure exactly why the immunizing bees against bacteria might also protect them against viruses. It may be because bees' immune systems aren't specific as those of humans and other mammals. Anything that revs up bees' immune response may help them take on multiple intruders. So maybe there's a base load of infection that makes it hard for them to fight off other things. We're just trying to think it through and what is really happening. All right, so this is a great news story because it represents a progress being made in understanding colony collapse disorder, because colony collapse disorder is not just one cause. It's a multivariate cause with internal potentiating factors. And the way that hives work, people who are outside of the study of apiculture think of hives as being made up of a bunch of individuals in a hierarchical setting where there's a queen bee and so forth. And it turns out that that is a impoverished way of looking at colony type organisms, because colony organisms are made up of individuals that we would understand, but those individuals are not individuals the way that we think of ourselves. They are a part of a system and a structure that makes up much, much more complicated interactions than we actually understand yet. So I'm really delighted that there has been some progress made in this way, but also, not only that, that we're getting a better understanding of how colony organisms and their internal immune systems of the individuals are these more complex systems. All right, there's my good news for our
I
conversation today.
I love it. I would say a couple of things that came to mind was when you were talking about the. So I have a couple thoughts to your good news. the first being, it's crazy to think that not only while these uh, scientists were developing a vaccine for bees, they what I always find is fascinating is how they're going to actually deliver it. And in this case, they had to understand the different structure of how the colony works versus how, like, distributing vaccines amongst us might work, or the livestock or the feed that we typically deliver. And that added layer of complexity required because it has to go through worker ant to a queen ant, into her larvae. Um, just a
Mhm.
fascinating little chain that has to happen there. So that was my first thought. And then the second thought is how it seems intrinsic to maybe the human condition that we've constantly found ways to leverage potentially our safety for increased brain growth, with the idea being that our increased brain size and therefore ability to think and reason will increase our safety more than us changing the environment to leverage increased brain strength, brain growth. And I find that really fascinating when you were talking about the agricultural revolution. So those are my thoughts on the good news.
Yeah, there's a really interesting thing that we can work with as a means of transition to our next topic, which is this idea that in in mammals generally, and in primates specifically, and in hominins more specifically, we can look at brain size correlating to the complexity of the social structure of those organisms. And so what that means is that if you take the skull volume of the ancestry that we have fossils for, and we take the skull volume of the primates that we can study contemporaneously with ourselves, we can see these interesting correlations between how many individuals a single individual in a troop or a tribe will have contact with in a given day. So larger brains correlate to larger, more complex social systems. In humans, for example, um, we might interact with or have social group sizes that can be as high as 150 people. And if you look at other primates that we can study in contemporary times, we might see that their troop sizes are limited to maybe 50 or maybe 30 or 25 individuals. And even though there's a lot of diversity and distinctiveness between all of these different uh, organisms and species that we could study and make comparisons, the through line is that brain size correlates to social complexity. And so what I thought was really interesting about that concept as a transitional topic is that when we get into topics like we want to address today, which is very complex, very layered and nuanced, and very rooted in the language that we can use to talk about it, that is the role that our complex social brains play in what we have come to term addiction. So take it away, Pearson. I think you have
Oh,
some thoughts on this to lead the discussion.
there could not be a better transition for that. That's really well said because I've been writing. I so just a couple of little fun things. I've been writing this book, as you know, and I reached some benchmark in my head of 50 pages. I guess that had a significant number for me. Um, and of course, I've been writing a lot about addiction right now, which is why I told you very excitedly, like, hey, I think this is going to be the topic. And that's because I'm writing about my own experiences with addiction. Very familiar with it. We've buddied up quite a bit in different ways throughout my life, and it's funny, the idea of brain size correlating with our social, like, network, is a really interesting concept. I can only imagine how much smarter we'll become because of the internet, and the internet implies a larger social network. Um, I wouldn't want to give credit to any of the social media companies necessarily for this, but the idea being that I would say yes, in aggregate, the internet definitely has made me smarter uh, than um, than when it existed before. So it's an interesting concept because I have been writing about addictions in a way that the more and more I think about them, I think of them as a relationship. And for purposes of this conversation, we'll call them addiction ships because that's what they are. I coined this phrase this morning during my writing, so um, very proud of myself for this one. But the idea is that in a lot of relationships, uh, addiction can mirror a lot of the same experiences that you have and even the cycle and system of a relationship. Now, an addiction is an unhealthy relationship. I should start off in case you didn't know. It's as if a hobby or something that is giving you some form of dopamine release or satisfaction or all the happy hormones that might happen with an activity, a hobby, or enter whatever this addiction is in your head. Um, Takes an imbalanced portion of your time, just like any other unhealthy relationship with somebody or something does. Um, I think at first you get the most amount of satisfaction from this thing, and it has diminishing returns. Uh, One of the insidious things about addictions is that as you get less and less from it, you have to do more and more of whatever it is, and you still get diminishing returns, but it takes more and more from you. And it, this creates natural imbalances, which lead to resentment. Imbalances lead to resentment in relationships, I think. And just like any other relationship, a relationship with addiction, you start to resent um, maybe whatever the addiction is itself or resent your need for that addiction can become a resentment. It leads to self-loathing and a lot of other things. Another insidious idea I'd like to get out early in my thesis about this is addictions. They, because they're unhealthy relationships, they lead to other unhealthy relationships. Your social sphere of influence uh, is dictated by who your relationships are with and who their relationships are with. One of the things you understand from one addiction, as long as you don't threaten that addiction, they're fine with you having a polyamorous relationship with other addictions. And in fact, these create symbiotic relationships between each other, and sometimes they feed each other and cause your addictions to grow. I know from my own experience, that would have been video gaming combined with chewing tobacco, combined with drinking alcohol. I would do these activities together in concert as I built these layers of addiction on each other. Um, so it's hard for me to sum them all up. There's so many that we could talk about, but I think this is a good place to start. Is the idea that addictions are relationships. They have a cycle. They're unhealthy relationships that um, are imbalanced. They build off each other. They can feed off of each other. And you start to create a structure and patterns of gaining and building addictions on each other, similar to like a house of cards or in the shape of a pyramid. So those are kind of the initial concepts I'd like to get out from my writings about my own addictions and how I view them. And this will hopefully wrap up when we get to the wrap up of our conversation. I'd like to talk about the bright side of these structures and how you replace these with very similar structures that are healthy and so we can get to that. But I'll leave the floor to you, Richard.
So thank you for that. A life well considered and the substance thereof, Pearson. And I think that's what we hopefully will bring to the value that we'll bring to our audience. And that we're far from being experts in any one topic that we're going to address, but at least what we're doing is passing along a lived experience that um, samples at some of those professional perspectives. And so what I'd like to reply to your thesis with is that the addiction and the study of addiction and addiction medicine almost can't progress without us doing a couple of things first, and that is to one, um, we almost need to invent new language. And I'm not going to delve too deeply into the history of what we now call addiction, but what I want to comment on is this idea that historically, when a a behavior or a movement was having an effect on our civilization, depending on the era that it was noticed or that people began to try to do something with it, the language they used during that period of time would have constraining features on its development, progress, and um, humane approach. So early on in the relationship that people had with alcohol, for example, and later distilled alcohol, was that people who consumed quote unquote too much of it had a moral failing. And that moral failing was also connected to other diseases, and you could say that people who had tuberculosis also had a moral failing or a failing of character or a weak character. And there were all these approaches to understanding it based on how people used language at the time. And of course, when you call something a moral failure or something that is a feature of a countenance, then I mean, how can you approach maybe not a cure per se, but maybe a remedy or maybe some type of ameliorating treatment? And so it was in the transition into the 20th century that the science of disease and the science of disease states begin to change the language, and we begin to make progress with treatments of all kinds of different human suffering disorders. Addiction continued to be kept in the moral category of human shortcomings, and it wasn't until um, the advent of the 12-step program that we begin to how see a transition from its moral implications to its social implications. And with that, we begin to make more progress towards understanding it better and better. So, what I want to introduce is this idea with regard to studying all forms of human behavior. This is the bio, neuro, social, and natural history model of human behavior. So we probably have heard of the biosocial model because that fits neatly with what we used to debate all the time, was whether something was learned or whether it was our nature or nurture, as my grandparents would have called it.
Mm-hmm.
But we wanted to leave aside the complexity that neurology would bring to that conversation, and we definitely wanted to avoid anything to do with history because of the implications on what people would have done leading up to that either diagnosis or those problems that someone was having. And this is the kind of the version of ancestor worship that has happened in Western culture and what has effectively become American culture. So bio, neurosocial, and natural history make up these complexities that go into how we can think about what it means to have a relationship with a substance, have a relationship with a behavior of some kind, or have a relationship with, as you said, relationships. Literally, that we can get ourselves into scenarios where the people that we interact with are nearly as toxic as the substances that we could take, and they create nearly as much damage to us in the long term. And so, given this idea of the bio-neurosocial natural history model of human behavior, we can begin to sort of tread into kind of what those different portions mean. And when I was thinking about our topic today, I was thinking about whenever you confront a really complex idea, it's the mid-century version of this metaphor is that five people, they're blind, and they all stumble into an elephant. An elephant is standing someplace where five people who are unsighted can stumble into an elephant. And they have never encountered an elephant before, and so they begin describing it to each other. Well, what did you find? Well, the thing I found is a broom. It's covered in bristles. It clearly is for cleaning. And the other person says, "Well, I found a hose. This must be part of some piping system or some type of fluid system." And the other people have encountered the legs, or they encountered the chest and so forth. And they describe it based on these things. And so you can get this picture of an elephant that's these five wildly different ideas about what an elephant is, but no one's ever put together the full picture. And so we're going to have a little bit of the five blind people encountering the elephant today in our discussion as well. So just because I have this really useful model that I have been put in place in my life, doesn't necessarily mean that we're one going to cover all the possible facets of this, or two that we're going to um, maybe include everyone's lived experience with this, which is an important idea. Let's make it distinction right away that we're talking about our lived experiences with this.
Yes, I think those are good addendums, and this feels very much, and we'll probably have a part one uh, on the
Yeah.
description below um, when it comes to this addiction topic, because there is just so many facets. I mean, even writing about my own, because I was trying to collect quite a few, like Pokemon or something. Uh, that alone was quite a big topic, and I know that, just like my traumas are unique to my lived experience, so are my addictions and the way that they coexist and interact. I thought it was interesting when we were talking about, like, would there be a cure for this? It seems as though we've gone into the social for addictions, but also we're looking at the physiological effects of your environment when you're being raised and how they interact with your social behavior with addictive
Mm-hmm.
substances and so on and so forth too. And I think that seems to be like the way that some of this is being explored right now with uh, you know some controversial books like The Body Keeps Score, and some things where I was Gabriel Mate or whatever, Gabriel Mate, I believe, wrote that one. Butchering his name, sorry about that, but I know he's got some pretty controversial takes, but there are some things in there that do seem to hold some water. um, and So yeah, we're absolutely not gonna be able to put a bow at the end of this conversation necessarily. And I feel like with these types of conversations, we might just be providing a framework for how to think about
Yeah.
these in a different way potentially than you've thought about things before when in the context of addictions. And if you have struggles with your own addictions, or you know people who do, this might be an interesting guide to thinking about it differently from our perspective, I suppose. Um, yeah.
If I could contribute to your introduction of a couple of different authors and their books, I went ahead and made a matrices of the six authors who are six of the probably closer to a dozen authors that I will ultimately bring up and talk about in our conversations. But in this part of the series, I want to bring up these six authors. So you mentioned Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate is the co-author of The Myth of Normal. And I will lean a little bit on Gabor Mate's definition as one of the ways of formulating what we're talking about of addiction. Gabor Mate's um, his approach to talking about this is setting aside the central thesis of the myth of normal. When he talks about addiction, he describes it as a solution to a problem. And that's a thing that we can hold in mind as I bring up these other authors, because ultimately what we are performing from the day that we're born until the day that we're laid to rest is a ongoing series of solutions that are made up on the spot, that are provided to us by biology and natural history, and those solutions either give us a long or a short existence on the planet. And so the fact that we all have several decades on the planet kind of together at the same time, we just see these as maybe snippets, but they're continuums. These are part of a larger picture. So Gabor Mate's idea of addiction is going to be, well, what is it solving? It's a solution to something. What are we trying to solve? So let me talk about these other authors that I have in my matrix here. So Janina Fisher is a person who also has collaborated with Bessel van der Kolk, who we'll talk about in a second. And what I took away from her work is this idea of the implicit memory and structural dissociation. So her most recent work is called The Living Legacy of Trauma, and it's a workbook that I had been going through with my therapist. And as we read through it and talked about the different chapters, there is a workbook section of the book where we can talk about um, answering some of the questions that Dr. Fisher proposes in the book. But I want to come back to this idea of the way that she comes to this title, The Living Legacy of Trauma, which is to say that one of the definitions of trauma includes what are essentially implicit memories, or memories that are pre-verbal. They are things that happened to us before we had language to describe them. And those pre-verbal or implicit memories play a specific role in the structural dissociation model, which is an introduction to the animal survival strategies. So Janina Fisher, this is someone who's a therapist and an author who gets at some of the intricacies of what is going on in the natural history of our lives and the social structure of our lives and the biology of our lives that have these curious products, because those curious products are strategies for survival. They're strategies for solving problems. Since we talked about him already, let's mention Bessel van der Kolk. So Bessel van der Kolk is the author of The Body Keeps a Score, which
Oh, that's
has
one.
really begun to become a primary source and one of the first stages in a person's path of discovery about trauma and how it's affected their lives. And one of the central takeaways of Bessel van der Kolk's work has been this idea that um, our brains map our surroundings. That's one of their central utility functions, is they're just a mapping feature. They do a good job of finding out where things that we need for life are located in space. And what they also do is they correlate that mapping strategy to um, life-threatening experiences, or experiences that could alter the course of our lives in some really disruptive way. And so what trauma is in the context of Dr. van der Kolk's work is a primitive map of a time when we were stressed in our survival that we apply later on to go about our lives. So this is the outdated map idea of trauma, that it was caused by a natural history event, or it has a natural history, is caused by an event or several events, and that we then use it later on in our lives to navigate a brand new, to us, unmapped part of the world, except the map is out of date. It would be like looking at a map of the city that you live in from 1850 and then using it in modern day times, and you would have a totally wrong idea of how to navigate the place.
Yeah, this river's not even the
The next
right
author,
place.
precisely, yeah, the river moved, and there's no bridges in 1850, and so
Yeah,
forth.
yeah.
Let me move on to the next couple of authors, and I want to mention Stephen Porges. Stephen Porges is um, the researcher and founder of the theory of the polyvagus or the polyvagal theory. So Stephen Porges has gained some fame and notoriety in the um, field of neuroscience and psychiatry with his idea about how the nervous system, the human nervous system, is constructed. So the central idea, not the biology of the vagus nerve, I'm not going to get into that now, but the central idea of the polyvagal theory is safety and social connection in human beings and how that affects our development.
Okay.
The vagus nerve is, in the biological sense, is the part of the peripheral nervous system that these are cranial nerves and they travel throughout the body, hence vagus or vagal or wanderer. And when you study the biology of the vagus nerve and then study human behavior in conjunction with that, you begin to see these really interesting connections between how our bodies respond to our environment, how that affects our brain and our thinking, and how we can reverse that by changing how we think or what our perception of reality is. So polyvagal theory plays a really interesting role in our social situation, which also has this really profound impact on our experience of trauma or healing from trauma. And naturally, there is a way to consider that in the discussion of addiction.
Mm.
The next researcher I want to mention is Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky is a neuroscientist, and I think we discovered his lectures at Stanford University. So he
Mm-hmm.
publishes lectures
Yes.
online. And look no further than someone who can really talk, not just at length, but in really accessible ways about the limbic system and allopathic stasis. So
Yes.
the limbic system and stress.
Which we
And
talked
his
about
book,
in, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, which we talked about in episode 2 during the isolation conversation in Veteran Isolation,
yeah,
which, if you guys
totally.
are interested, should check that out as well.
Uh, his book, Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Our Worst, really gets at the granularity of the topic of stress, how it affects our bodies, and how it affects our brains and behavior. And so the last person I want to mention, which is probably given me some of the most, um, in my project, has given me the most profound insights, and that is Pete Walker. And Pete Walker talks about complex trauma. He talks about not just that there could be a traumatic experience in our past, but talks about really in family systems where the 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 children are put in these situations where they have to use adaptive survival strategies or the animal survival strategies sometimes they're referred to, and those are your F's. So fight, flight,
Mm-hmm.
freeze,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
fawn.
Mm-hmm.
And fawn is one that Pete Walker probably workshopped to make sure he got another F, as opposed to one of the other less catchy ways of describing it. But it's also called attach. And so Pete Walker's book is called Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. But a central takeaway for most readers is going to be your survival strategy type. And just for the viewing public, I've decided that my survival strategy type is going to be a pretty handy blend of fawning and freezing. And these two survival strategies would tell you a lot about the type of family system that I came from. That in order to process and live through the type of, well, trigger warning, violent and hostile environment that I came from, I had to be able to manage up. I had to be able to, using a child's brain, by the way, this is not the adult brain I have now, this is a
Mm-hmm.
child's brain, detect danger and figure out ways to pacify out of control adults. So Pete Walker's book really spoke to me about this type of thing, which I hadn't really thought about very much. Because until somebody gives you a new model for thinking about your past, how would you even know? So I've just given you 6 different authors that are they figure prominently in my project, and they also all add their own version of approaching the elephant. If the
Yeah,
elephant in this case is addiction, they all provide their own version of the bio, neuro, social, and natural history model of what ultimately founds or is the foundation of our adult experience, and how, depending on what our access to substances are, or when we discover what a solution they can be to the problems of coping with these foundational experiences. So now that we have a model to look at human behavior, and we have some authors to talk about their perspective on these behaviors, I think we could really bring um, a much less judgmental idea, or a much less a judgmental approach, and an approach that suggests that there is a way out of these conditions, an approach that suggests that the healing qualities of human connection can be brought to bear to ameliorate and to completely remove the problems or consequences that are present in addiction.
absolutely. And I think that's a really good reminder to me because one of the things I definitely want to talk about, well, first, I can relate that fawn, I would say, would be my similarly one of my number ones, and then flight would be my second, and then
Yeah.
freeze maybe my third. uh, I don't know, between freeze or fight. It very much depends, but I would say fawn and flight for me. And I know that when I'm losing an argument with my wife, I go to the other room because she's destroying me and dismantling me intellectually, and she's right. And my man babiness is coming out, so usually I flee away. um, but yeah, so to relate on that first, the second thing is, as someone who's, I would say, conquered quite a few of my addictions, I'm very interested in trying to provide some form of a framework that people could relate to. And
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily because, like we said, how you got your addictions, it's um, could possibly be adiabatic from the way I got mine, of course, but there are going to be possibly some correlations or something that people could go, hey, that's me too. Similarly to the way when you described uh, your Fs, I felt very much in alignment in that, and that which might be why we relate as veterans, and we've been
Mm-hmm.
able to share about our trauma as we had similar structures. Um, One of the things, so I tried to identify like solutions for how you um, like positive solutions for how you tackle addictions, and realize that it's not just one solution. It was like multiple different types of solutions in concert to tackle the addictions, because the addiction really represents, and I think what we're getting to is the addiction represents a deeper tie to some form of trauma in your life, most likely.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think when people tackle an addiction, they're tackling it from the surface level, which of course you have to tackle it from the surface level. What that would look like would be, I'm addicted to tobacco, so let me get some nicotine gum, let me get uh, some nicotine patches and some other forms of physical counteractants that provide me with nicotine so that I can quit the act of chewing tobacco. Like these might be surface level fixes to a problem. But we know that the addiction of tobacco comes from some deeply rooted trauma. And sometimes rooting out the trauma through therapy or through positive feedback you're getting through your social environment that
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to curate to get out of the situation you're in. This would be like, hey, I've identified I have problems. I start going to therapy to try to figure myself out. And through that therapy, and honest conversations during that, we realize that I have to fix some things. Um, so this is the process that's so one of the things I just mentioned is social feedback, positive social feedback networks are essential to tackling your addictions. My like main one would have been my wife, who was there to tell me that I had problems with my addictions and that it was affecting our life because sometimes when you're in the addiction, you are ignoring the fact that it's possibly ruining parts of your life or affecting it, or you're in denial about it. That's a common term I think people like to use with addictions. So, your social network is extremely important to breaking this. And the reason I bring this one up specifically is because I wanted to talking about the fix first because I wanted to talk about why the social network and trust is so important in this network
Hmm.
when dealing with addictions. So going back to my idea that addictions are relationships and unhealthy relationships. When you start an addiction, it's really important to understand the context of the time when you started the addiction. And this is important for people who have friends or family who are addicted, or if you yourself are addicted, this is really key. Imagine you meet somebody. A lot of times the context of how you meet someone really matters what your experience is with that person. Are you hungry? Are you well fed? Well, does that matter? Absolutely. Like, are you hangry? Um, are you at a party? Is the music fun and you're a little drunk and tipsy, and then you meet a significant other type of person that you're attracted to, and they say something flattering? All of these things, like you're out with your friends, you're having a good time, and you meet somebody. These things affect how you this the way you meet somebody. Similarly, the way you meet an addiction. Typically, what I'm getting to is the context of the time is something around the traumatic experience that you've had, and you're using this not to survive, but to cope. Maybe survival and coping are mixed together, but it's a coping mechanism that is releasing certain hormones that are going to balance your mental state in the meantime, or it's the strategies like you have said that you find to deal with the situation that's happening.
Hmm.
And because that, I think it creates types of relationships that are super unhealthy that we've known before. Meeting people when you're really drunk might not be the most healthy and best way to get a first impression of someone and them you. Uh, meetings in this case, because you're experiencing trauma and you're introducing this coping mechanism to yourself, it can act as if it's saving you. And we've heard studies and relationships about what it's like to be saved by somebody. There's a lot of interesting things that happen to the psychology of the two people in that experience, like the lifeguard rescuing the woman from the ocean or whatever.
Hmm.
They can tend to fall in love with each other immediately or be hyper infatuated because of this event. Now, when I was writing, I kept thinking, like, well, if your addiction is tied to your trauma, you might be an experience where you feel like your life is being threatened. If your vagal system and your prefrontal, not your prefrontal cortex, your limbic system, and everything is firing FFFF, all of the Fs are firing. You're in this compromised state where your prefrontal cortex isn't activated, and you're trying to find ways of surviving the situation. And so I think about all of these things creating a very insane context for how you meet your addiction, especially that first one, because this one, by it being the first one, it most likely will be the most solidified and calcified within your hierarchy of addictions. If you have a hierarchy of addictions,
Hmm.
it'll be the base or the foundation of the pyramid, whatever analogy we want to use there. And so, what's really important when we're looking at that is the for you, if you have the addiction, you have to have some trust and ability to take the criticisms that come from this positive feedback network you're trying to create, because they're going to be attacking something that is emotionally extremely rooted to you. You have like I said, you have an imbalanced relationship with this thing. It's part of you. It represents things that saved your life during really traumatic experiences. And so when someone who's identified this as a problem to your well-being and to maybe your relationship with them, they're attacking it because most likely they care and love you and like you, or some part of them is invested in your well-being. Um, and that's what they're doing, but it might feel as though they're attacking parts of your personality because of it's entrained you. They're attacking family members in your relationship, people who might have served better. That addiction might have served you better than the family that you're using that addiction to escape. And so this was really kind of a aha moment for me when I was writing and just writing this idea out. And this might not apply to everybody, but I thought it was important to understand the context and in the context of when you meet an addiction and how this relationship is formed and how you get used to creating this structure when you meet new addictions. If it worked out for you before, your body is naturally going to, your and your mind are going to try to seek out those same conditions when you're in a state of the F's within your life again, potentially. And so those were kind of my initial thoughts on behavior when it comes to this social relationship of addiction.
So I want to give you a reply to this, which is going to hit upon a couple of authors. I think I might even bring up Pia Melody in my response because I didn't mention her before, but Pia Melody's approach to this is one that's made quite a bit of influence in trauma recovery as well as addiction recovery because the the two are so the two are so inextricably linked. The fact is there are people that exist who had a secure attachment, who never experienced a trauma, and are addicted to a substance. They are absolutely out there. And the reality exists that there are people who live through pretty rugged traumas and maybe complex traumas, and they have this really surprisingly well-adjusted adult life that doesn't involve any obvious addictions. So those two extremes of the human experience exist. The rest of us all live right in the middle. We all live right there in the sweet spot of the intersection between uh, trauma and its attendant solutions that we try to bring to bear to deal with it. So Gabor Mate's central thesis to the myth of normal is this idea that I was seeking for probably a decade. So central thesis is that the root of a great many of our problems and maybe the cause of some things that we're calling traumas is the conflict between our authenticity, the natural inborn character that we come out of the womb with, and attachment. And he stresses this because there's this idea that we could be born and then maybe, once we learn to walk, we could just run off and be much more like a gazelle or something that can begin to run hours after it's born. And what he really wants to stress is not only is that wrong, we come into the world with a biological need for attachment that exceeds most people's understanding. That attachment is such a profoundly important idea that it was invisible to us for so much of our history because it's so obvious that a newborn baby is pretty helpless, so we have to get it to toddlerhood where it can be a little more independent and get it to childhood where independence continues and then adulthood later on.
And if I may,
To the
just to interject real
Yeah.
quick on that one, an example of that progressing in the modern day too is it went from like us understanding that when the baby is born, it needs to touch the mother. Skin to skin contact is so imperative, right? And like this wasn't immediately. I mean, in baby wards just 60 years ago, they were taking the baby away and to a different room and stuff
Yeah.
for you know, a night to let the
Yeah.
parents sleep and stuff. And now it's gone from even the mom needs to have skin to skin content that the child needs to experience. And I just said I have sons, sorry, that might happen every once in a while. The child needs to experience um, skin to
Hmm.
skin contact with both the parents. And this is now, and I think that's just a
Yep.
small little snippet, very micro to what to add to what you're saying right there, as far as like that intrinsic need for the human connection during the early development stage is just like we still don't fully, we're not even close to understanding how deep that runs probably. So
there are these interesting uh, branches and facets to the myth of normal, the book by Gabor Mate and his son. Um, they expound quite a bit on this, and they talk about maternity and how modern maternity is so violent to women. Or, excuse me, let me rephrase that. What I meant was the way that modern medicine is so violent to women's maternity and their offspring and that first moment of bonding and how they're treated throughout the entire prenatal to postnatal life cycle.
Yeah, you meant the
And
Supreme
so
Court is violent towards women in the maternity process. I got it.
Western civilization has a lot to learn and to grow in this topic area.
I
I
laugh
I don't
as
know
a
if it sounds
grotesque
weird.
joke, but
I don't know if it sounds weird to women listening to this that two men are talking about this. Uh, uh, Women, I speaking as someone for whom his relationship with his mother is unbelievably broken and tragic. Had that been differently, that my path through life would have been so much different because of the fractures and fissures and foundational destruction that took place between myself and the person that I shared a body cavity with for 9 months.
yeah,
So I know that there are nuances that we're missing on this idea of maternity, and I can't stress enough that we just don't treat women very well in this culture, and it translates to this problem later on with attachment and authenticity. And so when we boil it down to that, you can begin to see right away that the fission fusion nature of human beings, and I'll stop and define. Fission means to fizzle or to separate, and fusion means to bond. And it is absolutely the most natural condition for our species to be bonded, to separate a little bit, to bond again, and to separate a little bit, and to bond again. That is absolutely the structure of our civilization at its core, because it happens within the development of children.
well,
And
gee,
so,
Richard, that looks close to like a sine wave right there. I have to say, just
sure does, doesn't it? So Dr. Mate's central thesis is the conflict between authenticity and attachment is the root of where we begin to see the problems in our culture. And those problems are always going to be health outcomes and quality of life outcomes, and not whether or not people are productive members of Henry Ford's manufacturing facility. That's not what he means by that. What he means is, can these people in this civilization and culture have the longest possible life with the best possible outcomes for their health that lead to the greatest well being for them during that period of time? These are important definitions here.
yeah,
Not whether or not we are very good little manufacturers putting toothpaste caps on toothpaste tubes.
yeah. So I would akin that to one of the fixes I have for when we undo the structure of addictions is you're replacing it with hobbies and healthy things that um, add to your journey for finding meaning and purpose. And what it sounds like is that a healthy, happy, long life um, is in the pursuit of meaning and purpose and cycles of finding meaning and purpose because once you found your meaning and purpose that might just be good for the context of the time then and that should
Yeah.
change as you go through your benchmarks of your life. So I just to add to that, meaning and purpose are really important in this uh, in the addiction conversation as it defines kind of the misty mountain in the far goal of your self-discovery when you're going through this journey.
Yeah.
It's something to look up to. This is my Lord of the Rings reference as you're traveling to Mount Doom or wherever, the far mountain in
Mm-hmm.
the distance. You can look to it. It'll help you. along the way to kind of guide you, but you have to keep looking down, so you make sure you don't fall into a bog or run into an orc or a spider or whatever, along the way. So
So the next thing I want to introduce is a little more context for polyvagal theory. So if we start with this idea that attachment and authenticity are going to be um, a balancing act for the developing person, then what is going on internally is instructive for what's happening in this balancing act. And so a major idea that comes from polyvagal theory, once we get past the biology of it, is that um, in the context of how a nervous system detects safety translates to how that nervous system interacts socially. So if you put safety on a sliding scale and social interaction on a sliding scale, you will see these interesting correlations between greater safety correlating to greater social interaction. Remember, social interaction is a feature of attachment. Whereas if you slide it towards less safety, you get these outcomes that are much more correlated to animal survival strategies, which correlate to less attachment or less social adaptability or less pro-social behavior.
I'm
So
picturing right
poly
now. Oh, I sorry. I was thinking of I watched the Alone series, and if you want to see an extreme version of this trauma,
Mhm,
I've watched 10 seasons of it, and I would say most of the people who go there exhibit an extreme version of that sliding scale. And they
mhm,
found their coping mechanisms are survivaling, doing survival trips out in the woods, doing this for fun. This is their hobby.
yeah,
I would say 98% of those people without any psychiatry experience or anything else are heavily traumatized individuals from their past. Um, they've found ways to exist within their sphere that
mhm.
seem relatively healthy, I hope. But it'd be interesting to look at them in the context of what you're explaining right now.
So I don't know that I'm building to this. I think it's just another idea along on the path of our discussion and discovery here is what I would call a common language of safety. So a common language of safety is going to be um, the accumulation of facial features, facial interactions. Is if the people that you're interacting with can see you, the way your face is shaped will change their internal environments. Touch, we glossed over it a little bit, but I am glad to circle back and say we now know that uh, skin to skin contact between human beings is the precursor to the production and release of oxytocin, which is a neurotransmitter. And if you want to know all there is to know about oxytocin, look no further than Robert Sapolsky. He'd be glad to tell you all about it. But that neurotransmitter oxytocin is about the bond of attachment.
Hmm.
And now it's going to start sounding circular here. So our face, our physical contact, and the tone of our voice all are part of a common language of safety. And the main idea with this is that the words matter, but less so than the tone does. And when you combine these features, if you're using them towards the um, the pro-social part of attachment, on that slider, what tends to happen inside of us, our internal system, is that it tends to be regulated more towards allostasis, right? It tends to be we regulate our internal features and internal systems much more towards the rest, repair, and digest versions of our biology. This is such a huge idea that not just being nice to people, that's not quite it, but literally these empathic, attuned connections that our eyes and face and vocal tone and physical touch can make all the difference in a developing Homo sapiens, that's us, a developing person's internal healthy environment. And what this leads to then, and maybe it feels like it's circling back around, is this idea of attachment style. So, attachment style can be really partitioned into two, but guess what? The people who have secure attachment, they just have secure attachment. It's basically one thing. It's if it's secure attachment, it's very easy to identify, and we could observe our friends who have secure attachment with great jealousy because they just drift through life making friends, ending relationships easily, making new relationships, having these casual experiences in life that just look so incredibly not available to us. And then we have everybody else who has insecure attachment. And that's all these different varieties and flavors of it that range from anxious to avoidant, me,
Hmm.
to, some other variation on
People pleaser, always trying to please. Very not
yep,
not doing enough right now. Not doing enough to impress
right?
my
You'll
my people. Um,
absolutely.
it's funny. I was just thinking of Pete, one of my colleagues from school. I'll just say Pete, his first name for now, not to
Yeah.
blast him out. But I remember when you meet these people, the unicorns, and I can say this because we talked
Yeah.
in person. But I anytime I meet somebody who has, I guess, experiences a lot of allopathic stasis, they I always go, what were your parents like growing up? I always ask them about their parents. I like what their relationship is with their parents, and then like,
Yep.
and it's always like, oh, me and my best friend, my dad are best friends, and like, oh yeah, my mom, yeah, they're all like, and he would tell stories about him and his dad and him and his mom, and like they were always really good stories and stuff, and I was like, yeah, because he'd experienced traumatic events as an adult,
Hmm.
between some pretty what would have been harrowing experiences that would have left a mark, and he seemed just generally unfazed by any of it. It was a life experience, a fun story at the end of the day, and he, survived and
Yeah.
everything's fine. And so I just thought of that when you were talking about this spectrum of people, and the unicorns that are the people who experienced um, really good feedback from their family during their formative years of development.
So to recap, what I'm communicating about these two authors and they're people with professional degrees. I mean, Stephen Porges is a PhD in the topics of neurobiology, and Guy Ramade is a physician. Like his training is in medicine,
Hmm.
and their approach to this is informed by their training and background, and their ideas and theories have merit if for no other reason than we can look at the counterpoint, which is your friend Pete.
Yeah.
And so when we describe these secure attachments, we describe these family systems that are balanced in how a person develops so that their authenticity develops along with their attachment to their caregivers, and that there's a common language of safety within that family system. You get these really terrific outcomes. And they are so unlikely to become a person with a statistical disorder later on because of these foundational ideas. So then that kind of suggests that the rest of us probably have some version of that sliding scale where attachment and authenticity, maybe it's biased towards attachment and our authenticity is lost. Maybe there's not much of a common language of safety. And so we developed the we develop these animal survival strategies to compensate for that lack of safety. And an idea that you sort of touched upon is this concept of integration, and that people with a very poorly integrated sense of self are open, they're vulnerable, they have vulnerabilities to external features that would help them tolerate this.
Cope and
So I
tolerate
want
the
to touch,
imperfect structures.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So
And
what you're
so I want to
saying
mention,
is, oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, you're saying we should call our parents immediately and yell at them for all the trauma they caused. No, I'm joking. That's a
let's
joke.
not, and
I
let's imagine that we did that.
I have a joke, and actually, I just want to make a note. I know you're in the middle of it. That I have a lot more to say right about this section here,
Mhm.
and the family structure and that allopathic stasis. But go ahead. Sorry, I just wanted a reminder quick.
So this idea of non-integrated parts reflects back to Janina Fisher and her work that where she uses what's called structural dissociation. And structural dissociation is this fragmentation of a um, attachment styles that are not secure. It's attachment styles. It's diplomacy under any other terms. I think is another way to put it. Like
Yeah.
secure attachment is the ideal diplomacy of the human interaction with all other features of our lives.
So we'll call them
But
non-ideal attachment styles, I guess, for
yeah, they would be non-ideal for our long-term health, our longevity, and for the outcomes of our experience with life,
yeah,
because they configure us to be prepared for what I would call the violent privations and austerity of scarcity.
yeah,
Violent privations and austerity of scarcity. That idea, those words are what our ancestors had to live through. Those were the filters that they lived through to become the sapiens that we are today in an industrialized agrarian civilization. And they these adaptations work really well under those conditions. If it is if things are scarce, if conditions are austere, and there is violence afoot, then you need fight, flight, freeze, and fawn to negotiate these terms, to negotiate these environments. They're wonderful for that. They're
absolutely.
just really tough on they're really tough on the thing that we're actually even better at, the thing that we're naturally set up for, which is a interconnected intersubjective experience with about 150 other Homo sapiens.
Yeah, it's this is why people say addictions are so they can be so malevolent and um, ingrained in the system is that they also feed some of the behaviors that are counter to fixing the addiction, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they integrate with your life in a way that isolate you from the things that would
Mm-hmm.
probably fix you. They in the fact that they take up more and more of your life and provide less and less
Mm-hmm.
um, good feedback, which means that just like the law of the conservation of energy or any of these, intrinsic physical qualities of our universe, same goes for time and yourself and the energy that you have. The more energy you put into these unhealthy endeavors, by that very nature, you have less energy and time to put into things that would get you out of these situations. So it can feel like there's momentum to it, or more like it's a weight that I think I've described to you. Is it's felt like putting every day feels like it's putting individual weights on your back, but you don't feel it, but you do. Your brain is more tired, you're more tired in general, and also your lifestyle is tiring you out even more.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what you do, as you go through life, you're walking through this sand that you can't identify that is always getting higher, closer to your neck, or whatever the analogy is. One of the things that I wanted to touch on specifically about addiction too is um, I'm thinking about this very much from a Western cultural perspective too, and I know that that should go without saying, considering I was addicted to video games when it really kicked off in my teenage years at like 14, 15, and 16, I would say. Um, but one of the things that I have to say with these addiction styles and coping mechanisms is you might be feeling or experiencing all of those in different periods of time in concession. And a lot of times how these impulses of fight, flight, fawn, and all these things are being activated at the same time, and how confusing that can be for your system. If you're creating
Mhm.
if you're creating neural pathways the most when you're young, and you have all your limbic system is just firing on all cylinders because each of these are being activated in concert, it can create a real confusing mess salad, which is why I think some of these addictions tend to intertwine with each other as well. Um, I think personally of my own living situation where a lot of the security and safety was constantly oscillating between different portions of this state where it was always feast or famine in my household. So like, we would have money and suddenly we wouldn't. And so there was this constant knee jerk of what our stasis was. And much of living in my household was like living with someone who had multiple personalities, depending on if they'd been drinking, if they were there, how their day had gone.
Mhm.
And that the idea that societally during the 80s and 90s we had both parents having to work and not be there. I see the game addiction that I had being very much tied to a lot of other young people's video game addiction, where you find solace in a place that provides stability and escape to something that's stability. It rewards you with benchmarks. If you do well in the game and you follow the rules, you're rewarded suddenly. And I think about um, how all of this talks about the addiction and the healthy individual is all different ways of talking about finding stability. And I think that is just such a core and central theme to how addictions happen, and then also how you actually get out of addictions. The through line is the method and what you're using to find stability. And when you're young, you have imperfect solutions, and which is what these addictions represent, imperfect solutions to find stability.
Mhm.
And as an adult, thankfully, if you're listening to this and you're struggling with this, or you have people who are struggling with this, it's on us to use our own logic and reasoning in concert with other people who have the same goals, which would be defeat your addiction and find reasoning and purpose and happiness. Everything we've mentioned, it really to you're going to be finding better ways of stabilizing yourself is really what we're talking about, and finding alternatives to how you stabilize yourself as a fully formed adult, and fixing a lot of those methods and strategies that you used potentially to stabilize yourself as a child. That's really what overcoming addiction is at the end of the day. And I think it's a really good way of framing it, because you're responsible for a portion of it, because of course you made the decision you had to make with the best methods that were available to you at the time, or at least what you thought. And now being presented with new information as a scientist, which we love to talk about, and we do like the scientific
Mhm.
method, we get to change our strategies and update them and update that roadmap that you were talking about that doesn't work anymore, that's not mapped onto reality that we live in now. And so I just wanted to mention that, because I think it's really powerful what, with all the authors that you've brought up, what they're all leading to, I think, is this central theme of stability versus instability.
I I'm going to make a bid here that we maybe wrap this phase of the conversation up. And what I want to do is introduce another um, major thinker and author in this space, and talk a little bit about her model. And then, if we could make some closing remarks, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And that is, I mentioned Pia Melody earlier, And Pia Melody is someone who had a background in nursing, and she's worked at addiction centers, and um, she did what you and I are doing, Pearson. She started putting together some dots, and she started noticing trends in the people that she was treating. And when she would interview them and get into the depth and substance of their lives, the pieces all began to fit together in this um, pretty clear pattern. And that was what ultimately became the Meadows model and her 5 core issues. And so I'm going to read those to you. The first of the 5 core issues is, how was I valued in the family? So a person's sense of value, it turns out, is unbelievably important to the path that they take through life, because it um, it shapes the decisions that they make, and it shapes how they interact with other human beings, whether they think of themselves as on par or if there's a one up, one down situation. So, how was I valued in the family? How was I protected from parents, family, and friends, physically or emotionally? So, family systems can have people who are well adjusted and caring, and their common language of safety is, present. But there might be people in the family system that are hazardous, that are just outright predators, and they fit into these family systems where what otherwise would have been a healthy system or healthy enough, uh, those predatory people make up the balance of threat and ultimately the traumas that you would leave that family system with.
According
So
to the statistics, I
how?
would say that that makes a large portion, actually, and not so
Yep,
insignificant, if not the majority of a lot of
yep.
incidents that have to do with rape and other child abuse. I would say statistically is not an insignificant number of what you're talking about. But yeah,
So how was I valued? How was I protected? How was I expected to behave in the family? There's this idea with regard to this expectation of behavior, which gets expansive. But one of the features of the answer to this question was, or is, what emotions were allowed in your family system? Could you have emotions that had the full range, or were you pretty limited so that really all you got was anger and maybe sadness? If that was what you were limited to, it has a profound effect on the rest of our lives, because it means that our strategies for interacting with our friends and spouses and people in our future families are really constrained. It means our negotiations are constrained. So how was I valued? How was I protected? How was I expected to behave? Number 4, how were my needs and wants taken care of? There's a there's a pretty expected misunderstanding about what it means to have your needs met, because the English language is impoverished in some ways, where this idea of needs is mapped onto um, maybe impulsive desires, or things that we want. We would absolutely know that a new product or a new something that we could add to our lives, something that we can consume, would make all the difference. But it turns out it's not a need fulfillment. It's satisfying, as we're talking about today. It's a solution to a problem. And it's not an intrinsic need. And intrinsic needs relate really closely to meta, our metabolic needs. They're connected exactly to what I've been talking about with the um, shared language of safety and
yeah.
connection. They address attachment. So how was I valued? How was I protected? How was I expected to behave? How were my needs met? And number 5, how was I disciplined or contained? Because in that wrestling match between authenticity and attachment, you can get some pretty hairy outcomes because of the way that the adults conceptualized your bid for authenticity, and how they decided that whether or not that fit within their accept what they accepted as limits of behavior. And this is to say that we need to be contained as young people because we're working with a nervous system that's trying a lot of stuff, and a lot of the things that we can try out, for example, between the age of 1.5 and 5, could be really antisocial. And so without
Or
containment there,
dangerous. Like
precisely
I
dangerous to
mean,
us.
more you're really, as someone with, a 1.5-year-old and a 4-year-old, you're trying to keep them alive, and you have to stop them from doing, what they're thinking is exploring, but they're exploring
Yep,
wrappers on the ground and, dangerous things all over the place, dangerous things in the bathroom, kitchen, so on and so forth, dangerous heights, dangerous
yep.
amounts of water. And so you're really trying to protect them from that first. Yes. So anyways, to
So
digress.
both things, an internal protection and the external, which is the pro-social behaviors. Well, there's a history in our civilization for violent physical contact in this containment. And that has extreme consequences for that individual later on in life. So these 5 core issues: how was I valued? How was I protected? How was I expected to behave? How were my needs and wants met? And how was I disciplined? All are a formulation for the types of we can call them negative outcomes for the people that Pia Melody was treating throughout her career in in nursing. And I wanted to bring those up here at the end because they both capstone what we've been talking about. They're a nice, easy way to conceptualize all the different things that I mentioned earlier on with attachment and polyvagal theory. But what I want to I'm getting a phone call here on my computer that we got to turn that off. So what I wanted to say here is that not only are they a capstone, they're a pretty good introduction to what we can talk about next,
Yeah,
because these circle back around and begin to address what we experience in our most formative and uh, the years where we were going to be the most influenced by our environment.
absolutely. I think that's a really good ending point for the purposes of this conversation. This might even be split into two videos already, what we have. So,
Yeah.
um, depending on when I go through, if it seems like there's a two-part to this, clearly we have so much more to talk about when it comes to this. I feel like we're just
Mhm.
barely scratching the surface. Um, but yeah, I think it's a phenomenal thing to understand yourself. When you're addressing these problems, I think the biggest thing is trying to understand it. And the key is like you're not going to understand it all before you experience getting rid of an addiction and what that feels like and what it's like. And they're not all the same because you didn't get them all exactly the same. And so if you've listened this far, thank you for listening, and hopefully you check out our other stuff, and we'll be talking about this more. And it was really enjoyable having this conversation with you, Richard.
I have to return the appreciation because when we think about the value to ourselves in taking a project like, I don't know, treating our own therapy, that's pretty good for ourselves. But there's also the part of me that has compassion for people who are struggling with the same exact things or can relate to the things that you and I had lived through, and that we do some of the best work that we can do as human beings is to pass along these lived experiences, the substance of a regarded life, because almost it has to positively affect someone else who can relate to these ideas. And that would be the most meaningful thing that we could leave behind, is that legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that idea. Well, and with that, I have to say thanks, everybody. If you liked what we're doing, please leave a like, a subscribe, comment. I believe we have our email listed in our Linktree channel. You can email us if you're a veteran and you want to talk about any of this or explain your lived experience, and maybe we can talk about
Mhm.
a veterans issue that is important to you in the future. And with that, thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Pierce. Signing off then.
Yep.
See you, buddy.